Hello and welcome back to Watching Brief for the week of the 17th of June 2024. I am joined as ever by my co-host, Mr. Andy Brockman. How are things down there, Andy? I gather you've been struggling with two-factor authentication this morning.
Yes, struggling and losing. The Google stroke Meta or whatever we're calling them this week have not been playing ball, and I've now got 119 emails in my inbox which I can't access on my laptop at the moment, so I'm feeling a bit I'm technically stressed.
119, man, that's quite good. I've got 900 unread. But anyway, we are going to be trying something a little bit different this week on Watching Brief. We're going to be looking over our previous efforts in this series to really highlight the relationship between archaeology, the public, and people in power, namely those people who at the moment are electioneering, trying to get us to vote for them, with a view to giving you a sense of how you should be thinking about your decision at the ballot box in the coming weeks. And leading up to the actual vote on the 4th of July. I think as we look over the playlist, we're going to see not only a direct relationship, but also some gaping holes, some really big missed opportunities that archaeological leadership have not seemingly seen. And if not directly influencing your vote on the 4th of July, this should hopefully influence how you communicate with people who you want to be interacting with these folks who we're putting into Parliament a little bit more effectively. So, without any further ado, let's head on over to the Watching Brief playlist. So, here we are. I thought it was more than 7 years worth of Watching Brief, but that's just what it feels like working with you.
Like it, exactly.
Yeah. I thought we've been doing this for about 10 years. But to be fair, I think we've been working on archaeological news and, in that sense, current affairs for a decade or more. But I think we formally started this Watching Brief enterprise, consisting of 423 videos, 424 including this one on this playlist, back in 2017. And it's interesting and quite telling that the first episode on this Watching Brief, not including the introduction, is to do with the Stonehenge bypass A303 down in Wiltshire. And this is still a very live issue, isn't it? But it directly connects the public, archaeological interests and government in a way which hasn't been particularly healthy at times, shall we say.
That's to put it mildly.
Yeah.
No, I think it's really interesting, and it's emblematic of the position and the issues that archaeology has in relating to the physical landscapes that it deals with and the political landscapes that it exists within. Now, I mean, when we introduced the Watching Brief back in early 2017, we said that it was about dealing with archaeology as news and current affairs. It wasn't about the history and the archaeology, because lots of other people do that much better than we can. We didn't want to do journalism, just repeating other people's press releases. We wanted to take a view and express a view and ask people to interact with our view. And there is no more high profile case than the Stonehenge A303 bypass and upgrade. That first Watching Brief discussion in January 2017 was about the launch of a consultation into what is effectively still the current, it's been tweaked slightly since, but it's still the current design for a short tunnel and dual carriageways across the Stonehenge and Avebury World Heritage Site. And the questions we were posing back then and throughout the times that we've discussed it since is whether it's appropriate for archaeologists to support something which is still working its way through the courts and has been found on a number of occasions to be unlawful. And certainly is contrary to what UNESCO say is best for the World Heritage Site.
Yeah. It's also interesting that there we have quite early on in this this run. Obviously, Druids and parking charges is quite amusing in that sense. But actually, more to the point, post-truth and experts, post-truth, culture war, all this sort of stuff was really getting going in 2017. was gathering pace, I think, in the wake of the Brexit vote, but also with the election of the Trump administration in the US, and
Yes.
Kellyanne Conway's alternative facts coming to the fore as well. Now, there's no more obvious a connection than a general election, and what we have in April 2017 is, in fact, the upcoming the upcoming general election then, and a question about how the heritage sector will and can leverage a relationship with the government, with the public, etc., etc. Now, this is something that we see becoming more and more live in more recent years, but we've been covering this since day one, folks, and it boils down to simple issues like, for example, here, number 23, in Northampton, the Eleanor Cross. That was a relatively local political issue, but it's one that you certainly identified as highlighting cracks in the relationship, in this instance, between local government, national government, and the public, I think.
That was exactly the point. Back in the spring of 2017, the nationally important listed Eleanor Cross, put up by Edward I as a memorial to his wife Queen Eleanor when her body was being carried back to London. The most famous Eleanor Cross was actually at Charing Cross, outside what's now Charing Cross Station, where there's a replica. Nice. In the case of Northampton, we had a local authority, the then Northampton Borough Council, which now no longer exists, although many people that were associated with it are still involved in local government in Northamptonshire. But claiming it had no money to undertake repairs, even though bits of stone were literally falling off the cross and were being photographed and posted on social media by local campaigners, and saying that and they had no money because local authority funding has been so squeezed, particularly since 2010, particularly in this last 14 years of Conservative, well, first of all, coalition and then Conservative government, that discretionary spend, or at least what is classed as discretionary spend, although if you've got custody of a listed building, you have a responsibility to maintain it, and that's what one part of the argument was about. But in that case, the local authority had responsibility for maintenance, but if it was, but if it failed to maintain it, it would have to bring a court case against itself for neglect of a listed building. It's one of the loopholes in the law. In the end, a deal was hatched with Historic England, and grant money was forthcoming. The local authority, in its turn, dropped its attempt to claim that it didn't have responsibility, which it had spent a lot of money in the courts trying to prove. And now, I have to say, thanks to a vociferous campaign led by local groups, including the Northampton Battlefield Society and a friend of the Watching Brief, the late Mike Ingram, the Eleanor Cross is now resplendent and restored on the road into Northampton.
Well, that's good. But also as well, it again highlights issues of funding. But also another story, and we will be gathering pace, folks, but it's just this one's just caught my eye. Another story which highlighted this complex relationship between locals and national interests and big business, actually, in this instance. And in that sense, I suppose almost the plans for an entire region, one might say, was the SOS Goodwin Sands campaign, dredging archaeology and war graves, highlighted there in May 2017. This story was fascinating because it's, as is so often the case, you had concerned local people aware of the history on their doorstep and the nature of the environment that they, of course, personally enjoyed because they're local, but also as well that they thought was being held, in some cases, sort of sacred for the nation, not least because you have downed aircraft and human remains from the Second World War in that part of the channel. But also as well, you had this strange situation where a company at times was actively going quite dirty on the campaign against people who were raising concerns about their plans to dredge material from that part of the channel to create an enclosed harbour, essentially further up the coast. Where do you think the relationship between sort of national government and the campaigning group here was revealed to be in this instance? Do you think it was a good look for people involved, or not?
Well, I think, like the Northampton story that we talked about a few minutes ago, the Goodwin Sands story, it absolutely typifies the situation we now have in heritage conservation, where major planning issues, which the public might expect to be adjudicated on their behalf by arm's length government bodies who are set up with that kind of remit, like Historic England and Natural England. And this was, the Goodwin Sands was a case which involved both. It was a case of the historic environment and the natural environment both being at risk. But the organisations which the public might expect to adjudicate on their behalf appeared to step back, and the plans were shown to be deeply flawed, not by those bodies adjudicating them as part of the planning system, and certainly not by the archaeological consultancies and environmental consultancies who were submitting reports to the planning system, whose work was found to be deeply flawed. And in one case I looked at, utterly incompetent, because you had an archaeological report which referred to the quote, the Protection of Military Remains Act, and the protection that gave to wrecks and crashed military aircraft. But said, that said these things were, that they consulted with the Commonwealth War Graves Commission and everything was fine. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission had absolutely no jurisdiction there. Their jurisdiction only began if human remains were found in association with crashed aircraft, for example. This is a company that would have been paid probably tens of thousands of pounds, if not more, for its reports, and it was incompetent. And you have to say, well, was that incompetent, or was it deliberately just trying to ease away a problem for the developer, Port of Dover in this case?
Which is an issue that's uncomfortable, I think, for many archaeologists in the UK to come towards. I think when I was a student, there was this notion that there are good and some bad archaeologists out there, some bad apples who effectively work for. It was almost framed as being one working for the enemy. Now, when you are a student, you sort of imagine that they're going to be, working for companies like, say, Odyssey, Marine Salvage, this kind of thing.
We'll come to them later, yeah.
No doubt. But actually, it's much more subtle than that. And it's the relationship between essentially an employer and an employee. Archaeologists are employed by developments to help them find archaeology, but also inevitably to help them get the development done in some respects. Yes. And yeah, it can be a bit of a struggle. Now, we're just going to flash forward to October 2018 before I get distracted by anything else on the screen. And
there is a treasure trove in our back catalogue, folks, and please browse through and enjoy.
It's genuinely.
It's not all political. And
no. Oh, but also as well, there's the wonderful Muppet of the Month that we really need to bring back in some respects, definitely.
Well, I think, given the state of the profession at the moment and the state of the heritage world, and the fact that there's a new edition of a new season of Ancient Apocalypse has just been announced, I think there's every likelihood it'll be brought back very soon.
I'm not sure I'm ready to return to talking about Hancock just yet, but in October 2018, we were talking about HS2, interestingly enough, and the future of British archaeology. Not only at this point, but actually for quite a while, it had been framed as being the Golden Goose, one of the big civil engineering projects that was going to be delivering, as they say, spades in the ground for archaeology, and therefore work ahead of development for years to come, and would reinvigorate the archaeological sector. At the time, the head of English Heritage, I seem to recall, put out essentially an international call. We have international archaeological friends who were very excited by this prospect, because the idea was that there weren't enough archaeologists in this country and we need more. Come and help us dig what was being called a timeline, an archaeological line through the countryside ahead of the development of this railway line that would link London to Birmingham and then in turn to the north, however the north was being defined on a particular week, whether that's Manchester, Leeds or beyond.
North of Watford is the
north of Watford. Exactly, yes. Anywhere that's not London. Yeah, is
for anyone doesn't know, Watford is a town just outside the M25 ring, just north of London. So basically,
it's basically in Greater London as far as I'm concerned. But anyway,
the north is basically the kind of place where, I mean, given that Mr. Soup lives in the north, it's the kind of place where ancient maps they would have written "Here be dragons."
You can say that, but at least I can say north with a little bit of a wry smile, because actually here in the northeast, Yorkshire is considered south. So anyway, the point being though is that HS2 actually didn't end up delivering in the way that it was promised. The difficulty of rising budgetary costs, seemingly going up by tens of millions with every time someone blinked, it seemed, around this project, combined with pushback from landowners, combined with questions as to whether or not this is actually a good use of such a massive budget, led to it wasn't just the second half, was it? It was also parts of the first stage that were cancelled.
And I think. Yeah, and what we mentioned the culture war earlier briefly, but what brought this to a head under Rishi Sunak's government was the idea that there was a war on motorists, and HS2 was seen as part of the war on motorists, and it was massively expensive, but it was about trains, not about upgrading roads. Or even filling in potholes, and it was also associated with net zero and climate change, climate emergency, and that was being pushed back by people like Nigel Farage and people on the political right as being a woke project. So Sunak binned basically HS2 north of Birmingham. It was meant to be going to Manchester. It was also meant to be going to Leeds in a second branch. Both those branches were binned, and pretty much all of the archaeological work that went with them, because they were only at relatively early stages compared to the London to Birmingham branch. But the London to Birmingham branch, it's still unclear whether it will actually terminate at Euston, which Central London Station, mainline station, which it was meant to, or whether it will stop in the north-western outskirts of London and link up with the Elizabeth line, which wasn't built to carry that level of passenger traffic joining it at that point. It's a mess.
It is a proper cluster. Yes.
Yeah, but to go back to the beginning and the comments about archaeologists and archaeologists being needed to do the amount of developer-funded work that was associated with HS2. I mean, some of it went ahead anyway, like the massive Victorian, 18th and 19th century cemetery just north of Euston, which was seen in TV documentaries,
and which at the moment, as it stands, is archaeological work that might not have been necessary.
Precisely, but it's also tied in with another thing that we covered in the watching brief. Which happened just before we actually started recording Watching Brief, which was the Brexit vote, because the end of freedom of movement meant that archaeologists, particularly European archaeologists, couldn't just come here if they were needed. They would have to fulfill immigration, comply with their immigration rules, which have become increasingly strict over the last 7 or 8 years. and at that point, archaeology was being listed as a shortage profession. Government, the outgoing Sunak government, is talking about basically removing the concept of shortage professions, and the idea being we either generate our own workers in particular key areas, or we suffer the consequences of shortfalls until we have trained enough of our own workers rather than bring them in from abroad. And we don't know yet what an incoming, if there's a change of government, what their attitude would be.
Or shock, shock, horror, horror, shock, shock, horror, as the song says. We, we could actually, within the profession, get better at retaining archaeologists working as archaeologists.
That's a whole other issue.
That's
and
a revolutionary concept, I know.
Well, certainly to two particular organisations at the top of British archaeology, it would seem to be something that they don't want to touch with a proverbial barge pole in any meaningful sense. But we'll come to that later. But again, that's another broadly political issue. But we will come to that later, maybe.
Yeah. Now, of course, one of the key aspects of the way in which archaeology interacts with national level decision making has been the portable antiquities scheme and the definition of treasure. In January 2019, we started hearing rumours about a desire to revisit the definition of treasure, and this would eventually come to fruition months later. If not years later. It was only a couple of years ago, actually, I think, wasn't it? But ultimately, the rumblings began in January 2019, and this is where an intersection with a particular part of the public becomes very pertinent, and namely metal detectorists. Not metal detectors, those are the machines. Metal detectorists are the people who handle the metal detectors. And it's interesting how that's been one of the not even perennial, one of the constant threads in Watching Brief over the years has been the way in which archaeology and legislation interacts with this growing hobby. The hobby's stance and status as a group of people who can manage their problems in-house, and a lot of evidence to the contrary, unfortunately. And it's one of those things where I've all the way through, I found myself tiptoeing around and saying, now, not all metal detectorists are like this. Whereas actually, we get to a point where it has to be said some of that community are unfortunately breaking rules, and matters around the definition of what treasure is how it relates to the portable antiquities scheme, and therefore how people perceive their ability to gain monetarily from their discoveries has been a real sort of Gordian knot, I think, of a political, social, archaeological and national heritage issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably worth stepping back here a little bit and providing a little bit of context, and partly because it is such a contentious issue, even within archaeology, because there are professional archaeologists, our colleagues, who are 100% supporters of the portable antiquity scheme, others who would see it abolished tomorrow and have metal detecting banned.
Yeah.
And that's a political. A British government made a political decision in the 1980s, as the hobby of metal detecting was becoming more common, not to ban it. And that is that's a fairly common concept in British law and unwritten constitution. It's broad, very often quite permissive. If something's not outright banned, then it's okay. There isn't a default that a default duty of care in terms of the historic environment, for example. There's specific legislation, but that doesn't cover absolutely everything. And the other thing that is an old concept in British common law is ownership, and it's there's a broad understanding in UK law that everything is owned by somebody. and therefore, if a landowner gives permission for a metal detectorist to find to search their land, and that metal detectorist finds something of value, it's up to those two to sort out if it's not treasure, which is governed by separate legislation. But if it's not treasure, they can do what they like with it, and they can come to an arrangement to sell it and split the proceeds, or the landowner will donate something of relatively low value, or it's hands off, arm's length, except for the Treasure Act. Treasure Act replaced the old law of treasure trove, and basically made certain items you had to in England and Wales you have to report them by law within 14 days. So if you find something, the obvious example, something made of gold, an object made of gold, or more than 5 gold coins, I think it is. That was the old basic Treasure Act. Archaeologists lobbied to have things of non-precious metals included in the Treasure Act if they had sufficient importance, and the flagship case was the Crosby Garrett Roman cavalry helmet, which did not contain any precious metals, couldn't qualify as treasure, and was found in the Lake District and flogged on the private auction market, and has hardly been seen in public since. The amendment to the Treasure Act was brought in, and that's what we're starting to discuss there, which extended the law of treasure, the definition of treasure, to include things of local or national importance that didn't necessarily have to be precious metal. In a nutshell.
Well, and also including now as well ferrous metals as well, and not
that's the point. It included objects that weren't of goldy and silvery.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah. Now, of course,
I think so. Just very quickly, I think the other thing that this came about, and it's something we've discussed a number of times in the Watching Brief, and again, there'll be other occasions during on the playlist where we do discuss the issues. It's the rise of metal detecting, particularly the rise of unregulated metal detecting rallies, where there is because the Portable Antiquities Scheme. This is the other half of the political argument here. Portable Antiquities Scheme is operated through the British Museum. But it receives central government funding, and at various points, including arguably at present, it has either been partial. Its funding basically isn't sufficient for the demands on finds liaison officers and the treasure system to operate efficiently, quickly, or even comprehensively. For example, some years ago now, the Portable Antiquities Scheme withdrew from trying to cover rallies. Simply, I think, partly philosophically, because they object to them in principle, but also, actually, I think it has to be said, because of the capacity within the system. The amount of work that will be involved if a finds liaison officer entered into the Portable Antiquities database everything that was turned up that could and should be reported to the PAS from a rally would be unsupportable. And yet there is no obligation on the individual finders to make those reports. It's entirely voluntary, and again, a lot of archaeologists find that unjustifiable.
Another area where the relationship between national political entities, government, particularly government leaders and ministers, and our heritage really comes to the fore is with regard to the British Museum. Here we have the first of various stories linking the British Museum to the Elgin Marbles. January 2019, the British Museum apparently said it will never return the Elgin Marbles. But also in July 2019, we have coverage of the British Museum and a trustee resigning over BP sponsorship and also repatriation issues. This is, again, perennial is the wrong word. This is another thread through which has woven its way through the rich tapestry of Watching Brief over the years. And that is, what the British Museum says, what the current mood is at the museum, what the current mood is in number 10 Downing Street, and how actually increasingly those two moods don't have to align, in fact. One of the most amazing things that we saw, and again, this is another explicit relationship between high office and the heritage sector in the UK, was the appointment of George Osborne, former Chancellor of the Exchequer. That's the person who
architect of austerity.
Architect of austerity, which did untold damage to the sector beginning in 2010, 2011. The Chancellor of the Exchequer being the person who holds the purse strings for the country, for those people who don't know, becoming the head of the board of directors, I believe. Is it the chief executive officer?
He's the chair of the board of governors.
Chair of the board of governors. That's it, for the British Museum. And oddly enough, I would find myself years later actually saying well done to George Osborne on his stance of trying to find a common sense relationship between the BM and the rest of the world, particularly in this instance with Greece. Even in the past couple of months, we're seeing more reports, especially from Greek newspapers, highlighting discussions between the BM and Greece. It's been interesting to observe that on that thread over the past 7 years or so, I think.
Definitely so, and I think first of all on the Elgin marbles, or the Parthenon marbles, as I think we tend to call them these days. And in fact, I notice our terminology sort of changes through watching brief as the arguments developed. But yeah, certainly the mood in the room regarding what is going to happen to the Parthenon marbles has certainly been shifting. I think just in the last few years, and particularly so since Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister and Keir Starmer became leader of the Labour Party. Because while Rishi Sunak has gone rightwards in a culture war sense, and in fact stood up the Greek Prime Minister at for a bilateral meeting, because the Greek Prime Minister had the temerity to mention the possible return of the Parthenon marbles in a BBC interview when he was asked about it specifically by the interviewer. Starmer has made noises along the lines of a Labour government will probably entertain a view to coming to a solution over the Parthenon marbles. And just recently as well, we've seen a piece of research which suggests that the core piece of evidence that the pro-retention lobby have been relying on, a supposed contract or authorization of firman from the Ottoman court in Constantinople issued to Lord Elgin, representing the British government in Greece, then an Ottoman possession. There's no evidence it ever existed, that it may well have been forged.
Interesting.
It certainly doesn't appear in the new research in the Ottoman archive suggests there's no record of any kind of legal handover of
and so one might say by selling them to the British Museum, they were laundered.
Another issue that we've dealt with at various occasions on the watching brief.
Interesting.
It's an area where there's a lot of ongoing research, plus changes in the ethical frameworks of the cultural sector, so that decolonization is now seen as an important part of the work that we do. And again, it's where we've butted up against culture warriors on the right over issues, for example, like acknowledging the role of chattel slavery in the development of the British Empire and the wealth generated by by Britain and people who were exploiting enslaved African people in, for example, the Caribbean.
Which, of course, we saw become a live issue in heritage surrounding the Colston statue in Bristol. Now, at this point, I'd just like to just say, for folks at home who might be curious, my cursor is, in fact, available for free as a download. You can go and find it on the Archaeology YouTube channel or on the website. You'll notice that its default is a stoned arrowhead. It becomes a survey stick when you put it over a typable window or field, and it is a trowel for digging into links when you hover over a link. I'm quite proud of this little set of of cursors, and if you want them, you can have them for free.
But can I just butt in there? If you, as Mark may be about to say, or might be too British and retiring to talk about ugly things like money. I'm not. If you like the cursor set, and I think it's terrific too, but maybe you might want to say thank you by following ArchaeoSoup to Patreon and maybe bunging a few quid to ArchaeoSoup, or maybe even following the links to the Pipeline website, where we look as well at a lot of these issues in detail and break these investigations.
And of course, Andy has a Ko-fi account as well.
I have a Ko-fi account. You can buy me a Ko-fi or a beer or whatever you want to call it. But either of us, this work takes time and effort, and we love bringing it to you. But if occasionally you could buy us a drink or bung us a few quid, we'd really appreciate it.
Yes, yeah. Thank you, Andy. I didn't even think to do that. Diolch yn fawr. So what we have here is, in flashing forward to December 2019, we did a review of a decade of archaeology. As we were approaching 2020, we were interested in how things had developed over the course of the past 10 years. And I think this is possibly why it felt as though we've been doing this for more than 7 years, is that we have been. We've been paying attention to this. I've been doing ArchaeoSoup since technically 2011. Actually, technically 2010, technically. And of course, you've been interested in specifically media and archaeology and related interests since around about the same time.
The two big stories that first got me into this kind of archaeologist current affairs and investigative work, and my old catchphrase, archaeologists aren't always the good guys, were two stories really that broke around 2012, which was Odyssey Marine Exploration and HMS Victory 1744.
Yeah.
And the issues around that, and then secondly, I mentioned them earlier, Northampton Borough Council and the sale of the statue of Sekemka on the private market when it had been donated to the people of Northampton as a museum exhibit.
It's interesting. When I first got to know you in that sense, and the work you were doing, I did get the impression that you were a dog with a bone, and the bone was Odyssey. And it was interesting to see your fascination. I think probably with that as a business model, but also in that sense, it's been interesting to see. You could argue versions of the idea of monetizing heritage more and more formally and in a more and more acceptable way, coming out, for example, in trend one that we identify there, with budget cuts necessitating new ways of doing archaeology. So, for example, crowdfunding becoming more and more necessary, not just a nice thing to do, but something which actually gets a lot of projects done. We see that formally in terms of a business plan in the form of Dig Ventures, for example, here in the UK. It's been interesting how to see, and I'm not saying that the two are directly comparable, because Odyssey essentially relied on investment for the next project all the time, didn't it? And also delivering promises that they couldn't necessarily deliver because they couldn't necessarily get the rights to bring up a whole load of material from the seabed. Just again, cut to the chase very quick. Briefly, for people who aren't familiar with the story, Odyssey Marine Exploration was, or is, it still exists in a shadow of what it once was, but an American company based in Tampa in Florida, which at the time I first started looking at it, marketed itself as the premier company to research and recover treasure wrecks. They did presentations at investor conferences, for example, where they were saying they wouldn't touch a project if it wouldn't return at least $250,000 in profits. In fact, it lost money hands over fist. Its accumulated deficit was in the tens, if not hundreds of millions, but it kept on rolling on loans and deferred loans and refinancing and dilution of shares and so on and so on and so on. Because one day they might get that big haul of monetizable gold,
precisely.
silver, port,
Yeah.
whatever, from the seafloor down.
Absolutely. In the course of all that, having been run out of Spanish waters and roundly defeated in the courts by the government of Spain over a cargo which it effectively stole from a Spanish warship, the Senora de las Mercedes, it had built up a relationship with the British government and had claimed to have discovered the wreck of HMS Victory, which was a British ship of the line that sank in October 1744 in the English Channel, with loss of all hands. Cut to the chase, it claimed to have reached a commercial contract with a British charity called the Maritime Heritage Foundation. The Maritime Heritage Foundation just happened to be run by a man called Lord Lingfield, who just happened to be a mentor to many senior members of the Conservative government, including the then Culture Secretary, Jeremy Hunt. And I did say that very carefully. Cut to the chase again, there were a number of issues around Odyssey's relationship with the British government, which were exposed, not just by me, but by a number of people, including possibly cheating the British government out of a couple of $1 million of money from a wreck called the Gesopper, which they basically rewrote the salvage rules. And in fact, that particular issue cost the British government $15 million. I think it was, or £50 million. Anyway, £50 million, sorry, because they had to compensate another salvage company who had submitted a competitive bid to do the recovery, but obeying the rules, which Odyssey rewrote.
Yeah.
It was a complete, there's a technical word which we use in government. It was a shit show. It was incompetently handled by the government officials involved. Odyssey ran rings around them, but they were eventually exposed. And for one thing and another, Odyssey is now allegedly officially out of the shipwreck business. But watch this space. There may be some more news coming soon.
Out of the ship show business, yes. So we'll come on to another point of, again, national government competence in just a moment. But this is a real sort of, I think, highlight of the playlist, these episodes, these 5 episodes where we identified trends. Trend 1, budget cuts and crowdfunding. Trend 2, fake histories and open archaeology, both with regards to access to for the public to history. Trend 3, development and large-scale archaeology, and the complications and relationships therein and thereof. Trend 4, metal detecting rallies and the portable antiquities scheme. And trend 5, bullying within archaeology, but also archaeology being seen as well-being and a wellness activity. It's definitely worth taking a look at those episodes as a roundup for our observations, I guess. Now, if we do flash forward to May 2020, by then something big had happened globally. There was a little thing called a pandemic, or the pandemic was unfolding. Yes. And this question of guidelines, emergency measures, and the way in which archaeology management, national government, and others were having to communicate with each other, health advisors, the NHS, for example, and ultimately trying to find a way to carry on doing economic activity, frankly. Archaeology being part of the economy, but certainly being a key aspect of people's lives and their ability to earn a living. That was an interesting episode that unfolded in the context of Boris Johnson, for example, as our Prime Minister, national strategy being made up in a very ad hoc manner, and national responses from the archaeological sector coming along in a very piecemeal way. I seem to recall, actually, it was primarily individual units themselves who were coming up with the ways and means that they were going to be interacting with COVID restrictions, but also actually with, for example, the furlough scheme, and even going beyond the furlough scheme to look after their employees. again, there's not, obviously there's more to say there, but I think again it highlights this relationship between the public, national government, and heritage in that sense.
And I think particularly if we see it through the prism of the development system,
Yeah.
because if we look at what's happened in archaeology and the perceptions of archaeology and what archaeology does, particularly since the COVID pandemic in early 2020, there you had archaeology, unlike many other parts of our national life, for example, the arts and culture sectors. Archaeology was part of the at least the developer-funded part of archaeology didn't close when the museums did.
No.
Because the government took the view that that part of the economy had to be kept going, whereas theatre, museums, galleries could be put into stasis.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
of course, there were many rules around the relationship between independent people, independent businesses, small businesses. Thankfully, I was on you might say the right side of those rules, so I could benefit from furlough, whereas an awful lot of people weren't in terms of being self-employed or newly self-employed archaeologists. It was a very difficult time in that sense.
There's also, we talked about metal detecting earlier. There's a I won't say a standing joke, but there's certainly an observation among many of us who, including some metal detectorists actually, who look at Metal Detector World, who note with a slight sort of wry lift of an eyebrow the number of metal detecting rally companies who previously had gone out of their way to avoid any kind of scrutiny, for example, using encrypted WhatsApp and private Facebook groups to organize what are effectively commercial rallies. Suddenly, in the spring of 2020, registering as companies with Companies House so that they could apply for exemption as businesses, so they could still run their operations and still take in money. And then the number, all of those companies pretty much dissolving themselves when the COVID rules came to an end, and astonishingly just before they had to submit accounts.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Yeah.
It's a really interesting thing. It happened.
Yeah.
Draw your own conclusions, folks. It happened.
Now, of course, during the pandemic, we did see the massive cultural event of the toppling of the Edward Colston statue in Bristol. This, again, is part of that undercurrent of the so-called culture wars, but also is a consistent reminder of how, for example, we saw it a little bit earlier with the British Museum, how people perceive the past as being variously a political issue, depending on, really ultimately, on how much they think they care about something. That's something that I find fascinating about this sort of stuff, where had you asked most of the people who got very angry about the toppling of the statue if they knew who Edward Colston was before it was toppled, they would have said no. And yet the argument was that the statue being taken away was somehow removing knowledge of Edward Colston. In some ways, it highlighted and actually augmented a very difficult portion of history for Bristol. And to this day, I think they're still trying to come up with a decision exactly as to how and where the statue will end up. They were interesting times. I mean, what did you take away from the toppling of the statue? Of course, we should say that those people who were prosecuted were not sentenced. They were deemed
found not guilty.
They
did not do anything wrong. They were found not guilty by a court and jury of their peers.
Yeah.
Which was very unpopular, not least with the then Home Secretary, who changed the law as a result. But to try and make it more difficult for somebody to plead justification in those circumstances, which is effectively what happened. In the end, and I remember being part, and we did a live stream debate on this, didn't we?
We did.
Where we discussed it. My view is that in normal circumstances, I would deplore the deliberate damage to a scheduled ancient monument. It was grade 2 listed.
Mm-hmm.
In the case of Colston, I'm with the jury. I think there were extenuating circumstances. And in fact, the statue wasn't destroyed. Yes, he was dunked in the harbour. He was pulled out the following day. And he's now held by Bristol Museums. And the toppling is part of the history of that monument.
Yeah.
And as you've explained so clearly and quite rightly, it's actually made the issues of who Colston was, what he did, what his contemporaries did, how they were commemorated over 100 years after they died. In fact, Colston, the cult of Colston in Bristol really only begins in the 1890s, when that statue was put up. And as somebody who lived in Bristol, went to university in Bristol, the issues of Bristol's relationship with the Atlantic slave trade and enslaved African people, profiting from enslaved African people, has been. It was certainly an issue when I was living in Bristol in the late 70s, early 80s. So, and in fact, the toppling in context was a venting of frustration that the authorities hadn't engaged with what a large part of the population of Bristol felt was important, which was to actually have a more grown-up, modern relationship with that difficult history. And obviously Bristol's not alone in that. Glasgow, just this weekend we've seen an article complaining about the Kelvingrove Museum's new exhibition, which dares to suggest that one of the founders of the Burrell collection had direct links to the slave trade and profits from slavery, and seeing that as somehow being distressing to modern Glaswegians. It's not. It shouldn't be. It's part of the story. You have to. As historians, we can't ignore this stuff. We have to bring it to the public. Public will make up its own mind, and some people will object strongly to having these things pointed out to them. But that's tough. It happened. We interpret it. We didn't make it happen. We just report it.
Yeah, it's interesting as well how a lot of those people will call others snowflakes. It's fascinating, really, isn't it? Yeah. We also have a situation around about the same time where people were engaging with history and politics in very creative ways. One of the Muppets of the Month, this one in October 2020, was where a gentleman, I believe in Merseyside, was trying to use a reference to a clause, not that the Magna Carta actually contained formal clauses, in a draft of Magna Carta that never made it to be actually signed and brought into law, as a reason why his shop should be able to stay open. Yes. It was interesting how yes, in that again, history, the public, and politics were interacting there. But also, what I found slightly tragic about it was that in pointing out how incorrect he was, there was an awful lot of pushback in the comments and in the commentary surrounding it, where people said that that you were anti-business, or that you were somehow crapping on the little guy by pointing out that this was just a bizarre use of a piece of legislation that never was legislation. It never was a thing. I had an awful lot of sympathy at the time, as I just said. I had an awful lot of sympathy for people who were outside furlough, for example. I cared deeply about this, but this, dare I say, abuse of history, just because it made you feel good on social media at the time, was not a useful thing. It didn't do anything other than just make people angry due to a vast misunderstanding. But again, we have a live issue there, where, of all things, Magna Carta suddenly became a live political document. It seems for some people.
I remember that one very well, and it tied in with a lot of. And again, it was the beginning of what we now see as organised and often grifting COVID denialism, both sides of the Atlantic. And conspiracy theory on steroids. One of our archaeologist colleagues, Neil Oliver on GB News, has basically built a second career, or second half of his career, on this stuff. For me, I would just say that one of the things that I've learned in the 10, 12 years I've been doing this stuff, and in the time we've been doing Watching Brief, is a lot of respect for the law and for lawyers who, for archaeologists, can be on the side of the angels. Because it basically anybody, a member of the public, a developer, the government, can do something which is unlawful. And in the end, in Britain, the only way you can definitely finally stop them is going to law. That's what was happening in Northampton. That's what was happening with the Goodwin Sands campaign and others. Now you can argue that, as I said earlier, the checks and balances should be, it shouldn't be up to individuals and groups, members of the public, to engage the lawyers to do this stuff, to commission the reports that do look at the evidence objectively rather than subjectively, or only see the evidence they want to see. And as we've shown with Goodwin Sands and in others, that has happened, and it has happened on a regular basis, because it most recently, again, and most high profile with Stonehenge, where the government has been found to have, on a number of occasions, to have acted unlawfully.
And so this relationship between being unlawful, being competent, and having ideological bias, shall we say, has been really borne out in recent years. For example, with the story surrounding the shock closure of the Sheffield Archaeology Department, but also as well, this is still. It sort of went away a little bit, but it's definitely come back in recent days with the launch, for example, of Farage's reform platform policy, talking about the need to examine universities for undue, woke influences, Chinese influences, and particularly with regards to history and heritage. And history and heritage, as you alluded to a little bit, a couple of minutes ago, is something which is a very live issue for that kind of voter, because of the perception that, for example, our old country houses are under attack, or something that they consider to be foundational to Britishness is under attack. And more often than not, it's actually, unlike historians who do often, especially in the public eye, take a sort of a grand narrative perspective. You'll have, your Dan Snows and others walking you through the king and queen of so-and-so and how this related to that battle and so on and so forth. Archaeology, more often than not, is literally in the mud, scrambling through the rubbish, and has more of a bottom-up perspective, which can be seen as being politically revolutionary, something which has the potential to upheave our notion of actually how people were actually living in the past. And that was definitely current when Sheffield was under threat, and as that closure progressed. And I do believe that we're planning, are we not, on revisiting where the staff and possibly the students are at the moment in that story, aren't we?
We are, and it's in the context of, I think, actually probably a more important aspect of the issue of higher education and archaeology and heritage in higher education than perhaps the woke, the allegations of wokery, for want of a better word, and that is that for a number of years now, the Conservative government, first of all under Boris Johnson, then under briefly Liz Truss, and then latterly specifically under Rishi Sunak, has talked about Mickey Mouse degrees and wanting to close down degrees that don't offer a decent return for students, which also means actually a decent return to the Treasury, because what the Treasury is concerned about is degrees that lead people into professions which do not return their full student loans, leaving the student loan book with the government.
Yes.
And so at risk most are professions which are insecure and lowly paid. Now, a lot of those professions lie in the arts and humanities, and including archaeology. Now, archaeology has survived in a number of cases because of the association with the building industry, but a number of things are happening there. First of all, there's a talk about moving towards archaeological apprenticeships, which the idea is providing a workforce that is ready to pick up a shovel and dig. And the idea being, you can do a practical apprenticeship in archaeology, but you don't necessarily need to do the theoretical background. In other words,
You don't need to know what you're looking at, just dig it.
Exactly that. You don't need to know why you're digging something, or why sometimes you don't want to dig. You shouldn't be digging something.
Yeah.
It's just about doing as you're told on a developer's site.
Yeah.
The profession needs to have a conversation with government about whether that's what it wants, and it needs to have a conversation with itself whether that's what it wants. In my opinion, and I think the other thing about higher education is, and it's where again our relationship with politicians, because they're the ones ultimately hold the purse strings and provide the legal frameworks. Do they want, first of all, local individual businesses like universities, because that's what they are now, they're businesses, they see themselves as businesses. Do they want those businesses to remove whole parts of that strategically are part of the UK economy, like archaeology, like people to work in the arts and cultural sector, musicians, actors, writers, historians.
I thought you were going to say hitmen then, sorry.
Look, do they want those decisions to be taken locally when they should be taken strategically?
Yeah.
But also, do we want to push back on the idea that things only have a value if they have a financial value, and that cultural value can be discounted? Now, I don't think cultural value should ever be discounted.
Well, but also, as we saw in the recent Heritage Alliance report, it's clear that heritage is actually highly profitable to the economy. It's just not it doesn't look as profitable.
Not to the people taking part in it.
Exactly.
That's not the problem.
It doesn't look as profitable close up. So it's also partly an issue of paying conditions and lobbying and moving towards, or helping people to move towards, having management structures and career paths and ways of working that actually highlight that value and reward people for taking part in it. For my part, my instinct is that just having a digging force who are directed by a special few archaeologists sounds an awful lot like the early days of archaeology, where you had essentially aristocratic archaeologists going often abroad, but sometimes it would happen in England as well. England. I'm thinking about things like Iron Age hill forts in the south of England, where basically someone would just deploy a bunch of local navvies to get digging. I think that would be a big step back, but really again it's for archaeologists and our leaders, and that conversation between us and them.
Not representative bodies, not leaders. I don't think archaeology. As we start to draw this to a close, and in terms of the political relationships that archaeology has and so on, I'd throw out a thought for discussion here, which is that archaeology does not actually have a leadership of any kind. What archaeology has is a number of representative bodies.
Tell that to them. They behave as though they are our leadership, as it were.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean they are.
No, I know. Hence, though, as I was about to say before you so rudely interrupted me, it's up to us to have that conversation, isn't it, with them about what they do, why they do it, and how they can do it better.
Democracy is about leadership by consent. When we vote in a government, implicitly we consent to be ruled by that government. We might oppose that government in the meantime and try and get another one appointed and another one elected, but we don't lose the general election and then immediately take to the streets and set up the barricades.
Oh, okay.
Traditionally,
I'll cancel my plans then. Sorry.
At least traditionally in the UK, we don't. Other
No,
countries do
put
behave
the
slightly
pallets
differently.
away. We don't need them. Don't need the pallets.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
No, but I mean, in all seriousness, there is an implicit contract in politics, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that just because government gets elected, we stop political activity for the next 5 years until there's another general election. It's not carte blanche for perhaps the best case in point was in the autumn of 2022, wasn't it, when Liz Truss was briefly Conservative Prime Minister and launched what was called the hashtag Attack on Nature by a consortium of groups like the National Trust and the RSPB and the wildlife trusts, who opposed the attempt to almost completely deregulate development, remove the checks and balances which primarily came from EU law. For example, the polluters pays principle in terms of environmental mitigation, which included archaeology. The fact that developers have to pay for archaeology, that was going to be watered down.
Yeah, and the response from those people who might call themselves leadership, I'm having to word that very carefully now, was to say that they don't want to get political. It's not their remit to get political. And almost that implied notion that actually what will happen, and things might change at the next general election. I suppose a key question, though, as we've been highlighting in recent episodes, is the extent to which those self-same people and bodies and institutions are actually engaging with people who are likely to be in government in a matter of days. No evidence of really that actually happening. Now,
well, the archaeological sector is very good at saying it's very, very important, very influential, and has lots of very important meetings with very important people, and it never tells you about them.
Yeah, and they don't turn up on Westminster Records either.
No, they don't seem to. But at the same time, the Heritage Alliance is out there. It produced that very hard-hitting report, which we spoke about recently on the Watching Brief, the We're Doomed report. Sorry, the On the Edge report. Doomed. We're all doomed.
Yeah.
But it was as we said at the time, it was a very powerful piece of work, very well presented. It was offering the sector some very strong steers over what to do. But as an umbrella group, there's only so much the Heritage Alliance can do, and it can't mobilise over 1 million members like the National Trust can, for example. No. Now, when we elect a new government on July the 4th, it is very likely on the current polling we'll have a new government on July the 5th, led by Keir Starmer, of the Labour Party. But that doesn't mean that things will only get better, as the song once said.
No,
because no, and in fact, particularly Starmer has talked about freeing up development and build, which could mean that there is another. It can be done in a number of ways. One can be speed up the planning system by appointing more planning officers to an under-resourced system, which is what they've talked about. But it could also mean, and there have been suggestions that they would water down planning restrictions, particularly with regard to large infrastructure projects like energy projects and so on, which could have a detrimental impact on the natural and historic environment. And archaeologists, historians, heritage people are going to have to come to terms with that, come to a position on that, whatever proposals are brought forward, and potentially oppose policies from something that very many of them have wanted for a long time, which is a change of government from the current Conservative government.
Yeah. But again, crucially, I think it's down to the conversations within the sector to hopefully have effective lobbying levers to pull. If we flash forward to October 2022, in addition to in May 2021 working with staff and students and giving those people a voice, and an opportunity to present how they felt about what was happening to them and their university. In October of 2022, we also had a FOI results coming back. This is just highlighting in both instances journalistic work this is a freedom of information request that you put in and finally came back, highlighting the relationship between Nadine Dorries, Dynamite Dorries of briefly or not the culture secretary for a little while, Mayor Ben Houchin, who's recently been re-elected, and
Sir Ben Houchin, as you know, or Lord Houchin, rather, as you know, is.
Sorry.
Do you want to start that bit again?
No. It was just you said Lord. Oof. Anyway,
I'm sorry.
Anyway, Lord Ben Houchin, essentially finding a way to make things happen, shall we say, on the Dorman Long Tower development. It was an explosive arrival in the post for Nadine Dorries, and it all again came about because of conversations between local politicians, national politicians, and actually, in her case, a unilateral decision as to what is culturally and historically significant and not. For her, personally, she did not see the tower as being culturally significant, and she did see it, seemingly, as relating to the Conservative mayor's plans for the area as being a necessary change that had to happen, namely the demolition of that tower. I'm wording all of this in as neutral a way as possible, by the way. Allegedly and all that kind of thing. But the point is, again, these conversations matter, and hence who you vote for matters. Nadine, by many measures, might not have been the most appropriate person to make some of the decisions that she made about our history, heritage, and culture. Again, I'm being very gentle with my wording, but it's all relevant in the build up to a national election or a general election. Sorry, Andy, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, as we were again approaching the end of this particular playlist, if I was going to ask you if you had a favourite story that we've covered, and if you asked me the same question, I'd have said this one.
Okay.
Because I think this encompasses so many of the issues that we've talked about in the course of this particular conversation in terms of the relationship between archaeology, heritage and politics, and why it's so important for archaeologists and heritage people to engage with political processes, however deeply flawed they are, and they are deeply flawed in many, many ways. Because what you had here was a branch of local government, Mayor Ben Houchin in the Teesside Authority, and national government, the ultimate interface being with the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, with the then newly appointed Secretary of State Nadine Dorries, whose appointment by Boris Johnson at the time was met by scarcely concealed laughter, contempt and incredulity. Because of her previous record. She'd been a junior minister at Health and was better known for eating, is it kangaroo anus or something on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here.
I didn't watch it.
No, I mean, one of the great self-publicists of British politics, who also known for writing, the kind of potboiler novel that sort of got into things like the Bad Sex Awards and so on. So somebody with absolutely no credibility, or seemingly almost appointed by Boris Johnson as a joke, because it would rile the cultural establishment. Yeah,
and this, of course, bit coming from a prime minister who prides himself on having studied classics at Oxford as well.
Yeah.
It was a bad joke, and I think he knew it in that sense.
And what we were able to show, and again, drawing on the work of others, but what we were able to show specifically about the destruction of the Dorman Long Tower, which is what we're talking about, part of the former Teesside Steelworks at Redcar, which had been in the local plan to be preserved as a memorial to the industrial heritage of that area. It was then, we talked about iffy reports. A report was written arguing that it had major conservation issues, but not saying that it was unsalvageable. That was then misrepresented, arguably, by Mayor Hoochin, as it would cost millions of pounds, cost thousands of jobs, and the money would have to be diverted from the NHS, all of which were, to use the technical term, bullshit. But Mayor Hoochin is nothing if not good at self-publicity, or, I think, to use the technical term, bullshitting an issue.
Or, most recently, campaigning, notably without any Conservative Party branding on his leaflets.
Yes, yeah.
Because, they're not popular.
But well, he got. To be fair to him, he got re-elected by the local election, albeit with a much smaller majority. And allegedly, the Labour Party weren't trying that hard, because, anyway. But no, cut to the chase on this one. What we were able to show was that Hoochin used back channels to the DCMS through Nadine Dorries' office to lobby for an emergency listing to be overturned. At the same time, he was releasing a press release claiming that Historic England had listed the building by mistake because a junior member of staff had been overseeing the case, which again was pure bullshit.
Yeah.
And one of the things that the FOI requests that we submitted showed was email traffic within Historic England saying, what can we do to put the record straight? We're being, effective. I'm paraphrasing here, but there were people saying, what can we do to keep, to put the record straight? We behaved absolutely properly according to the rules, and we're being lied about. But because the DCMS and Hoochin were in command of the process, we know that Hoochin had lawyers on standby to fight an attempt to injunct the demolition. In fact, nobody was able to bring forward an injunction.
No.
So we don't know how that would have ended. But and again, that's the checks about it. Historic England was steamrollered. Nadine Dorries was lobbied on a back channel, which other people didn't have, and then she made a decision. It would appear on a whim, and released herself a press release which misrepresented the situation, misrepresented what Historic England had actually said.
Yeah.
It is one of the most disgraceful episodes in recent heritage protection, and shows the dangers of what happens if unscrupulous people want to get their own way within the current system, how fallible that current system is, and how important it is that people with clout, wherever they come from, get basically engage with the system to keep them honest.
Yes, and
they won't do it by default.
No, and in that sense, what we saw was personal opinions, personal relationships, overriding process, and resulting in arguably an explosive act of vandalism in for me, a local heritage landscape. Regardless of where it ends up, it may well be that the project ends up being a tremendous success. That said, though, the road has got more rocky since the explosion occurred. Anyway, the point being, though, is that these are human beings who we vote into these offices, and their opinions can shift with time. And on the one hand, while saying that, for example, that they have the ability to pronounce whether or not a tower in Teesside is of cultural value, on the other hand, we do see that cherishing of our artifactual history being shifting around. So we started with the story about the Stonehenge tunnel in July 2023. We did see the green light given for the Stonehenge UNESCO site tunnel development. As we've already discussed, we don't need to go into this again. It's still in the courts in that sense. It's still not fully finished in terms of that process, but that conversation continues. We also see planning policy continually in the news, and conversations about that are probably about to happen under the next government, as you were saying just before. Not Rishi Sunak, Keir Starmer, saying that a Labour government, if they win, will likely visit and revisit planning policy. But also in December, given what we just highlighted earlier about the Elgin marbles, or the Parthenon marbles, I should say, Rishi Sunak, we reported in December 2023, losing his marbles over Greek Prime Minister Parthenon snub. You've already alluded to this, but this movement, this sort of cultural shift occurs because the people who we elect are susceptible to lobbying. They are susceptible to conversations. They are susceptible to their peers having opinions that might lead to things like towers being blown up, so on and so forth. I suppose that the final thing that we will highlight today in our playlist was in April this year, where we highlighted that red line tests for heritage protection in archaeology are happening all the time. We've just touched on a couple of these red line tests, but we have the old Oswestry Hill Fort, for example. Yeah. Back in the playlist somewhere there was the Battle of Bosworth Field, and electric car self-driving car producing factory, being built on part of that battlefield. And there were ongoing planning issues and debates and conversations about ultimately the value of heritage and how and why it should be protected, which we've also seen the flip side of because of local politicians supporting them. One thing that we haven't mentioned today in the playlist is actually the Crooked House pub. That was a huge news story in the past 12 months or so, and local politician support actually has led to people not. I think in large part, people not being able to smooth over some of these cracks. Essentially, public outrage being represented by elected officials can also ensure and help ensure that rules are enforced.
Although, in fact, that will be one to watch, what happens over Cricket House, because the owners who have successfully got a delay in the legal process, their appeal against the decision of the local authority that they have to rebuild the pub as was. And the two local politicians who've been foremost in supporting the community and wanting the pub rebuilt, Andy Street, Mayor of the West Midlands, actually lost his job at the local elections. He's been replaced by a new Labour mayor, and we don't yet know whether there will be the same push from the West Midlands mayoralty to come to what heritage people probably sees and the community probably sees a proper solution over what happened to the Crooked House, burned down so mysteriously just after it was bought by the people who own the landfill site next door.
Spoiler alert, it's not a mystery, but
no, allegedly it is. Nothing's been proven in court.
True.
There is an ongoing police investigation.
But our coverage highlights a very interesting sequence of events, shall we say?
Indeed. As does the coverage of a lot of the media, sailing very close to what it can say and can't say in terms of when there's a live police investigation. But also Marc, the Conservative MP for the area, who's also been very vocal and in fact tried to introduce a law towards the end of the most recent Parliament to protect heritage pubs. His seat is in danger at the general election. So there may the political leadership, the political representation, the political figureheads of that campaign may well disappear.
So I don't know about you, Andy, but that took less time than I feared it might.
Ask our audience whether they feel the same thing. But anyway,
that's true. But I think really the theme that we ended up highlighting there was, again, just to reiterate the fact that your vote does influence who gets into a position where they might end up, for example, in a ministerial position for which they are better or worse qualified or able to execute on behalf of your wishes. And it's worthwhile bearing that in mind. It's also worthwhile bearing in mind, if you're an archaeological heritage professional, what your unit, your institution, your professional body is saying or trying to say, or not, as the case may be, to these people who do make decisions along the lines which we've highlighted in that playlist, and ultimately in not quite our life's work, not yet, but certainly in our joint career. And hopefully this really highlights yet again why it is that we do what we do. It's not just because Andy is a bit of a political nerd.
It says here the person who's looking forward to the latest MRP opinion poll that's due out at 5. Anyway, go on.
You see, I didn't even know. It's not just because of that. It's also because there's a direct cut through. And when it comes to even actually, as a little insight into conversations that we've been having privately, even when it comes to planning potential projects that we might want to undertake or not, the viability of those projects is directly influenced by budgetary concerns, planning policy concerns, and the culture, ultimately the culture, small c, that surrounds culture, big C, in terms of planning policy and the mood when it comes to, for example, the value of heritage in education, university departments, etc. All of this stuff matters. And if you're sitting on your hands with regards to the question of who you might vote for, whether or not you might even vote, hopefully this helps you to see that through thread, because it is an ongoing relationship, and no doubt by the end of the year, Andy and I will be reporting on what the new administration, whatever colour it is when it gets in, are doing to our history and heritage. Any final comments from you, Andy?
Just really that I've always felt that we do have the luxury of the vote. People did fight and die for our right to vote, men, women. And therefore, if you don't vote, if you don't at least engage with the process, then you certainly have less right to complain about what you get. What we get is far from perfect, very far from perfect. And, there are lots of issues around proper representation, process, and so on, which are constantly changing. There will be challenges with a new government, which our sector faces, which will be different ones to were faced with the previous government. But it's not a case of a government, whoever forms the new government in July, it'll suddenly be bread and roses for the heritage sector, because it won't be.
No,
we are still in a deep hole. And not always treated with sympathy by people from various parts of the political spectrum. It's not a case of right good, left bad, or left good, right bad. It's a complex relationship, but we have to engage with the relationship if we want to have any influence on what happens, I think.
Absolutely. Thank you for your time today, Andy, as ever. Links to most of the videos that we've talked about, if they will fit in the link description, will be in the box below. Feel free to check them out if you're at all interested. Of course, the playlist is available on the ArchaeoSoup homepage on the YouTube channel. You can see all 24 videos there for your delectation and delight. Please do, as Andy said earlier in proceedings, consider supporting us on Patreon and or on Ko-fi. It is something that is obviously something that we're passionate about, but passion don't pay the bills, and it'd be fantastic to feel your support on those days when we maybe we're looking at at that sandwich on the shelf and going, can I buy that sandwich? Let's see.
And can I just chuck in one other very quick thing? We are planning a follow-up to this particular edition. It'll be next week when all the party manifestos are out. Just basically do a digest of what the various parties are promising in terms of heritage and culture, the things that are relevant to...
And we will make it interesting.
And short. And in fact, given the level of attention that issues of heritage and culture have had so far in the election campaign, I think it'll also be quite short.
Yeah.
But that's part of the issue. That's part of the point of doing this. But in all seriousness, though, we'll be doing a digest of the things that may well could have impact on heritage world, archaeology world. And also, if you've got any questions about anything we've talked about in terms of about the relationship of archaeology with government, with development and whatever, please let us know and we'll try and include those as well.
One final thing I forgot to mention in our conversation, but I'll put a link to it below. I'll put it up on screen for you now to see, is a video that we made that highlighted very explicitly this relationship between policy and archaeological direction, where a select committee was making suggestions that archaeology needed to be better funded, and no one picked up on it. The people who we would hope would be going, yes, woohoo, didn't. Again, all of this is pertinent. I don't know how that slipped my mind, but I think that is just one final really big red arrow pointing at this relationship and why we highlighted it today, and also why it so often comes up in our ongoing watching brief. Anyway, until next time, guys, do take care, and it's bye-bye from me. Bye-bye.
And bye-bye from me. Cheerio, bye.